Hi everybody, continuing with Harry Potter reading. I'm on page 67. Just to recap, so Harry's in Diagon Alley getting his things for the school year, and he met up with Ron and his family and Hermione, and then Ron heard Mr. and Mrs. Weasley talking about Sirius Black, who's the prisoner that escaped from Azkaban, and saying that it has something to do with Harry. And they should tell Harry, but Mrs. Weasley says they shouldn't. So that's the conversation Harry just overheard. I'm going to backtrack a little bit. Harry lay listening to the muffled shouting next door and wondered why he didn't feel more scared. Sirius Black had murdered 13 people with one curse. Mr. and Mrs. Weasley obviously thought Harry would be panic-stricken if he knew the truth, but Harry happened to agree wholeheartedly with Mrs. Weasley that the safest place on earth was wherever Albus Dumbledore happened to be. Didn't people always say that Dumbledore was the only person Lord Voldemort had ever been afraid of? Surely Black, as Voldemort's right-hand man, would be just as frightened of him. And then there were these Azkaban guards everyone kept talking about. They seemed to scare most people senseless, and if they were stationed all around the school, Black's chances of getting inside seemed very remote. No, all in all, the thing that bothered Harry most was the fact that his chances of visiting Hogsmeade now looked like 0. Nobody would want Harry to leave the safety of the castle until Black was caught. In fact, Harry suspected his every move would be carefully watched until the danger had passed. He scowled at the dark ceiling. Did they think he couldn't look after himself? He'd escaped Lord Voldemort 3 times. He wasn't completely useless. Unbidden, the image of the beast in the shadows of Magnolia Crescent crossed his mind. What to do when you know the worst is coming? "I'm not going to be murdered," Harry said loudly. "That's the spirit, dear," said his mirror sleepily. So that was the end of chapter 4. We're now on chapter 5. Here's the picture. Ooh, this is called the Dementor. Tom woke Harry the next morning with his usual toothless grin and a cup of tea. Harry got dressed and was just persuading a disgruntled Hedwig to get back into her cage, when Ron banged his way into the room, pulling a sweatshirt over his head and looking irritable. "The sooner we get on the train, the better," he said. "At least I can get away from Percy at Hogwarts. Now he's accusing me of dripping tea on his photo of Penelope Clearwater. You know," Ron grimaced, "his girlfriend. She's hidden her face under the frame because her nose has gone all blotchy." "I've got something to tell you," Harry began, but they were interrupted by Fred and George, who had looked in to congratulate Ron on infuriating Percy again. They headed down to breakfast, where Mr. Weasley was reading the front page of the Daily Prophet with a furrowed brow, and Mrs. Weasley was telling Hermione and Ginny about a love potion she'd made as a young girl. All 3 of them were rather giggly. "What were you saying?" Ron asked Harry as they sat down. "Later," Harry muttered as Percy stormed in. Harry had no chance to speak to Ron or Hermione in the chaos of leaving. They were too busy heaving all their trunks down the leaky cauldron's narrow staircase and piling them up near the door with Hedwig and Hermes, Percy's screech owl, perched on top in their cages. A small wickerwork basket stood beside the heap of trunks, spitting loudly. Excuse me. "It's all right, Crookshanks," Hermione cooed through the wickerwork. "I'll let you out on the train." "You won't," snapped Ron. "What about poor Scabbers, huh?" He pointed at his chest, where a large lump indicated that Scabbers was curled up in his pocket. Mr. Weasley, who had been outside waiting for the ministry cars, struck his head inside. "They're here," he said. "Harry, come on." Mr. Weasley marched Harry across the short stretch of pavement toward the first of 2 old-fashioned dark green cars, each of which was driven by a furtive-looking wizard wearing a suit of emerald velvet. "In you get, Harry," said Mr. Weasley, glancing up and down the crowded street. Harry got into the back of the car and was shortly joined by Hermione, Ron, and, to Ron's disgust, Percy. The journey to King's Cross was very uneventful compared with Harry's trip on the night bus. The Ministry of Magic cars seemed almost ordinary, though Harry noticed that they could slide through gaps that Uncle Vernon's new company car certainly couldn't have managed. They reached King's Cross with 20 minutes to spare. The ministry drivers found them trolleys, unloaded their trunks, touched their hats in salute to Mr. Weasley, and drove away, somehow managing to jump to the head of an unmoving line at the traffic lights. Mr. Weasley kept close to Harry's elbow all the way into the station. "Right then?" he said, glancing around them. "Let's do this in pairs, as there are so many of us. I'll go through first with Harry." Mr. Weasley strolled toward the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, pushing Harry's trolley, and apparently very interested in the Intercity 125 that had just arrived at platform 9. With a meaningful look at Harry, he leaned casually against the barrier. Harry imitated him. In a moment they had fallen sideways through the solid metal onto platform 9 3/4, and looked up to see the Hogwarts Express, a scarlet steam engine, puffing smoke over a platform packed with witches and wizards seeing their children onto the train. Percy and Ginny suddenly appeared behind Harry. They were panting and had apparently taken the barrier at a run. "Ah, there's Penelope!" said Percy, smoothing his hair and going pink again. Ginny caught Harry's eye, and they both turned away to hide their laughter as Percy strode over to a girl with long curly hair, walking with his chest thrown out so that she couldn't miss his shiny badge. Once the remaining Weasleys and Hermione had joined them, Harry and Ron led the way to the end of the train, past packed compartments to a carriage that looked quite empty. They loaded the trunks onto it, stowed Hedwig and Crookshanks in the luggage rack, then went back outside to say goodbye to Mr. and Mrs. Weasley. Mrs. Weasley kissed all her children, then Hermione, and finally Harry. He was embarrassed, but really quite pleased when she gave him an extra hug. "Do take care, won't you, Harry?" she said as she straightened up, her eyes oddly bright. Then she opened her enormous handbag and said, "I've made you all sandwiches. Here you are, Ron. No, they're not corned beef. Fred? Where's Fred? Here you are, dear." "Harry," said Mr. Weasley quietly, "come over here a moment." He jerked his head toward a pillar, and Harry followed him behind it, leaving the others crowded around Mrs. Weasley. "There's something I've got to tell you before you leave," said Mr. Weasley in a tense voice. "It's all right, Mr. Weasley," said Harry. "I already know." "You know? How could you know?" "I heard you and Mrs. Weasley talking last night. I couldn't help hearing," Harry added quickly. "Sorry." "That's not the way I'd have chosen for you to find out," said Mr. Weasley, looking anxious. "No, honestly, it's okay. This way you haven't broken your word to Fudge, and I know what's going on." "Harry, you must be very scared." "I'm not," said Harry sincerely. "Really?" he added, because Mr. Weasley was looking disbelieving. "I'm not trying to be a hero, but seriously, Sirius Black can't be worse than Voldemort, can he?" Mr. Weasley flinched at the sound of the name, but overlooked it. "Harry, I knew you were, well, made of stronger stuff than Fudge seems to think, and I'm obviously pleased that you're not scared, but—" "Arthur!" called Mrs. Weasley, who was now shepherding the rest onto the train. "Arthur, what are you doing? It's about to go." "He's coming, Molly," said Mr. Weasley, but he turned back to Harry and kept talking in a lower and more hurried voice. "Listen, I want you to give me your word." "That I'll be a good boy and stay in the castle?" said Harry gloomily. "Not entirely," said Mr. Weasley, who looked more serious than Harry had ever seen him. "Harry, swear to me you won't go looking for Black." Harry stared. "What?" There was a loud whistle. Guards were walking along the train, slamming all the doors shut. "Promise me, Harry," said Mr. Weasley, talking more quickly still, "that whatever happens—" "Why would I go looking for someone I know wants to kill me?" said Harry blankly. "Swear to me that whatever you might hear—" "Arthur, quickly!" cried Mrs. Weasley. Steam was billowing from the train. It had started to move. Harry ran to the compartment door, and Ron threw it open and stood back to let him on. They leaned out of the window and waved at Mr. and Mrs. Weasley until the train turned a corner and blocked them from view. "I need to talk to you in private," Harry muttered to Ron and Hermione as the train picked up speed. "Go away, Ginny," said Ron. "Oh, that's nice," said Ginny huffily, and she stalked off. Harry, Ron, and Hermione set off down the corridor, looking for an empty compartment, but all were full except for the one at the very end of the train. This had only one occupant, a man sitting fast asleep next to the window. Harry, Ron, and Hermione checked on the threshold. The Hogwarts Express was usually reserved for students, and they had never seen an adult there before, except for the witch who pushed the food cart. The stranger was wearing an extremely shabby set of wizard's robes that had been darned in several places. He looked ill and exhausted. Though quite young, his light brown hair was flecked with gray. "Who do you reckon he is?" Ron hissed as they sat down and slid the door shut, taking the seats farthest away from the window. "Professor R.J. Lupin," whispered Hermione at once. "How do you know that?" "It's on his case," she replied, pointing at the luggage rack over the man's head, where there was a small battered case held together with a large quantity of neatly knotted string. The name Professor R.J. Lupin was stamped across one corner in peeling letters. "Wonder what he teaches," said Ron, frowning at Professor Lupin's pallid profile. "That's obvious," whispered Hermione. "There's only one vacancy, isn't there? Defense against the dark arts." Harry, Ron, and Hermione had already had 2 Defense Against the Dark Arts teachers, both of whom had lasted only 1 year. There were rumors that the job was jinxed. "Well, I hope he's up to it," said Ron doubtfully. "He looks like one good hex would finish him off, doesn't he? Anyway," he turned to Harry, "what were you going to tell us?" Harry explained all about Mr. and Mrs. Weasley's argument and the warning Mr. Weasley had just given him. When he'd finished, Ron looked thunderstruck, and Hermione had her hands over her mouth. She finally lowered them to say, "Sirius Black escaped to come after you? Oh, Harry, you'll have to be really, really careful. Don't go looking for trouble, Harry." "I don't go looking for trouble," said Harry, nettled. "Trouble usually finds me." "How thick would Harry have to be to go looking for a nutter who wants to kill him?" said Ron shakily. They were taking the news worse than Harry had expected. Both Ron and Hermione seemed to be much more frightened of Black than he was. "No one knows how he got out of Azkaban," said Ron uncomfortably. "No one's ever done it before, and he was a top security prisoner, too." "But they'll catch him, won't they?" said Hermione earnestly. "I mean, they've got all the Muggles looking out for him, too." "What's that noise?" said Ron suddenly. A faint, tinny sort of whistle was coming from somewhere. They looked all around the compartment. "It's coming from your trunk, Harry," said Ron, standing up and reaching into the luggage rack. A moment later he had pulled the pocket sneakoscope out from between Harry's robes. It was spinning very fast in the palm of Ron's hand and glowing brilliantly. "Is that a sneakoscope?" said Hermione interestedly, standing up for a better look. "Yeah. Mind you, it's a very cheap one," Ron said. "It went haywire just as I was tying it to Errol's leg and sent it to Harry." "You were doing anything untrustworthy at the time, were you?" said Hermione shrewdly. "No." "Well, I wasn't supposed to be using Errol. You know he's not really up to long journeys, but how else was I supposed to get Harry's present to him?" "Stick it back in the trunk," Harry advised as the sneakoscope whistled piercingly, "or it'll wake him up." He nodded toward Professor Lupin. Ron stuffed the sneakoscope into a particularly horrible pair of Uncle Vernon's old socks, which deadened the sound, then closed the lid of the trunk on it. "We could get it checked in Hogsmeade," said Ron, sitting back down. "They sell that sort of thing in Dervish and Bangs, magical instruments and stuff. Fred and George told me." "Do you know much about Hogsmeade?" asked Hermione keenly. "I've read it's the only entirely non-Muggle settlement in Britain." "Yeah, I think it is," said Ron in an offhand sort of way. "But that's not why I want to go. I just want to get inside Honeyduke's." "What's that?" said Hermione. "It's this sweet shop," said Ron, a dreamy look coming over his face, "where they've got everything. Pepper imps, they make you smoke at the mouth, and great fat choco balls full of strawberry mousse and clotted cream, and really excellent sugar quills, which you can suck in class and just look like you're thinking what to write next." "But Hogsmeade's a very interesting place, isn't it?" Hermione pressed on eagerly. "In the book Sites of Historical Sorcery, it says the inn was the headquarters for the 1612 Goblin Rebellion, and the Shrieking Shack's supposed to be the most severely haunted building in Britain." "And massive sherbet balls that make you levitate a few inches off the ground while you're sucking them," said Ron, who was plainly not listening to a word Hermione was saying. Hermione looked around at Harry. "Won't it be nice to get out of school for a bit and explore Hogsmeade?" "I suspect it will," said Harry heavily. "You'll have to tell me when you've found out." "What do you mean?" said Ron. "I can't go. The Dursleys didn't sign my permission form, and Fudge wouldn't either." Ron looked horrified. "You're not allowed to come? But—" "No way. McGonagall or someone will give you permission." Harry gave a hollow laugh. Professor McGonagall, head of Gryffindor House, was very strict. "Or we can ask Fred and George. They know every secret passage out of the castle." "Ron," said Hermione sharply, "I don't think Harry should be sneaking out of school with Black on the loose." "Yeah, I expect that's what McGonagall will say when I ask for permission," said Harry bitterly. "But if we're with him," said Ron spiritedly to Hermione, "Black wouldn't dare." "Oh, Ron, don't talk rubbish," snapped Hermione. "Black's already murdered a whole bunch of people in the middle of a crowded street. Do you really think he's going to worry about attacking Harry just because we're there?" Okay, gotta stop there, guys. I stopped on page 78. See you next time.